Getting Together's stand on these questions is unequivocal. The Soviet Union, once ruled by the proletariat, is now under the rule of a monopoly capitalist class that has fully restored capitalism. The Soviet Union is fascist at home and social imperialist abroad, socialist in words and imperialist in deeds. It is a superpower and contends with the US for the domination of the world. Everywhere the Soviet social imperialists are enemies of the masses of people.
So let's get the biggest question out of the way. Why does China want to control the South China Sea? Well, military defense, sea lane control, fishing rights, and oil. The South China Sea, depending on who you ask, if you ask an American firm or a Chinese firm, there's somewhere between $1 and $20 trillion of oil wealth in the South China Sea. This would make China less dependent or entirely non-dependent on the Middle East, and in case of war or some kind of situation where the Malacca Straits or the Lombok Straits or wherever are blocked, this would make China's energy security so much more accessible, so much easier, so much cheaper, so much quicker. Plus, it would provide state and private companies limitless oil wealth, make the rich even richer, and, fishing companies can destroy the environment further, so there's that. Around $5 trillion of trade passes through the South China Sea, and China, being an export superpower, doesn't want to stop that. That's just leverage for them. If you were a rising great power, rising to superpower status, you would want to control something as leverage against the country that you are trying to overtake. Controlling a main and very globally important trade route seems like kind of a good one-up. It's kind of comparable to how Iran has de facto control over the Straits of Hormuz, where about 18 million barrels of oil pass through a day, at least in 2016. Yeah, so if America tries to push Iran, America knows that Iran could theoretically just close the strait, cutting off the world 18 million barrels a day. In 2016 alone, 16.5 million barrels passed through the South China Sea of oil imports, mostly going to China, South Korea, and Japan. China, wanting to dominate the region, can use this as leverage against American allies, Japan and South Korea. This kind of threat of cutting off Japanese and South Korean oil imports and goods exports kind of gives China a one-up against the United States in the region. The United States can't do this, or at least can't effectively and cost-effectively do this. I'll give a short and brief summary of the military defense strategy that China has, because I want to go into this more in depth later in this video, but also more in a separate video. Basically, China is claiming islands in the South China Sea. Yes, okay, have that established. Now, they are also building air bases, and they could theoretically build naval bases and anti-ship, anti-air, and anti-missile defense systems. Building these defense systems would create a barrier around southern China in the South China Sea. And that is where most of China's economic activity lies, so having some kind of southern front that's protected with weapons systems and air bases and naval bases gives China an added layer of defense that doesn't just relegate them to their coastline. But it also clears a path to the Straits of Malacca and other straits that gives them basically unfettered access to the Indian Ocean. And if you want to know more about that, watch my String of Pearls theory because it becomes important. America has some pretty long established military and economic ties with countries in the region like the Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand. China's rise to upend the global United States built order cannot happen if they're just relegated to their coastline. To give this some context, think of Hawaii, Guam, the Marshall Islands, where the United States has very important military installations there that allows them to project power outside of just North America and their coastline, allows them to project power and dominance into Southeast Asia or Asia in general. The United States has pretty much unfettered access to the South China Sea and to the Indian Ocean and so on. No country, including China, has actually historically been able to seriously challenge this. With China having a larger navy, increasing their navy size and navy budget, and building more carrier fleets and destroyer fleets, this kind of gives China the ability to push out the United States, because the United States doesn't want to risk a collision or some kind of actual full-out war. A naval collision could actually act as a spark for a full-on war. It just depends on who backs down first and the de-escalation tactics used. But I mean, given the orange fuckboy in the Oval Office, who kind of has a irrational sense of power and global politics, I don't really think he'll be the one to step down first. So, by using debt diplomacy, just like the United States had done in the late 1800s, China is able to economically assert dominance over the region with win-win diplomacy and the Belt and Road Initiative. Having those nifty anti-ship and anti-air missile systems and, potential ports in the region does also help. China, just like any other rising great power or rising superpower, depending how you look at it, will fall into a natural order, you could say. They want regional dominance, they want to upend the system of dominance by another country in the region, and this usually leads to some kind of imperialism. They want to evict the current power dynamic for their own. The United States did the same thing, with the Caribbean and the Western Hemisphere against the British Empire and their power struggle in the late 1800s. Luckily, this one didn't turn to war, but historically, there have been power struggles that have led to war. For example, with Germany trying to become a rising power and trying to dominate the seas around their area and struggling for power and dominance over Russia, France, the UK, you can kind of see how that turned out. Portugal and Spain struggled over trade route dominance, naval dominance, and colonialism in South America. But they prevented war only because one side got the Pope involved. The Pope at the time basically just drew a line on the map and said, this half is yours, this half is yours. And war was basically narrowly avoided. Do you see the trend here? One country trying to upend the established order of the other, they almost go to war. It's called Thucydides' trap. China is turning into a kind of arrogant rising power, and their struggle for dominance over the Americans is throwing the Americans into a frenzy. The Americans know that the unipolar system established by them post-World War II is coming to an end, and things like the sanctions, the warmongering, the fear-mongering, all of this is a kind of warning, a threat that America is going to lash out in some kind of way. You could argue that they already are with Trump. Make America Great Again is a perfect example of that fear. Trump has constantly rallied against China and Chinese companies for taking American jobs. With the slogan, Make America Great Again, it's kind of assuming that China has made America not great, and that he is the answer, or the antidote to the sickness. China's quest for dominance and their struggle with the United States on the global stage has pushed them straight into imperialist economic policies. This is the natural order of great power politics. A capitalist great power, which we can argue all damn day that China is capitalist. A capitalist great power has to grow its economy. It has to overtake the established country, being the United States. China doesn't have the national capacity to keep growing its economy. It has outstripped its resources with its need. This pushes it right into imperialism. And you can see this in the South China Sea, you can see this with their African bullshit, you can see this all over Asia. But we can't let China's opposition to America blind us from that. China's opposition to America is a smokescreen. For example, once America pulled out of certain weapons trade deals with Duterte over the whole Obama scandal between the two of them, Chinese companies moved in. And the Philippines is fighting an Islamic insurgency, as we all know, but they're also fighting a Marxist one. So how can someone rationalize the fact that China is actively funding a capitalist government trying to put down a Maoist insurgency? I mean, no one has ever used fighting Islamic extremism to give shitty countries weapons, right? But what are the effects of all this? What are the actual tangible effects of all this great power struggle nonsense? Well, rising nationalism and a arms race, perhaps? Southeast Asia really hasn't had very long and established, permanent borders, I guess. You had French Indochina, you had the Vietnam War, you had the secret bombings of Laos and Cambodia, you had the Khmer Rouge and the invasion of them. It's been a very unstable region. Plus, with British occupation, Japanese occupation, Dutch occupation, it's just been a bit of a shit show. But now that they actually have tangible, strong, defendable borders, rising nationalism as a byproduct is basically a guarantee when they feel encroached upon by a larger power in the region trying to dominate them and take their actual land. I mean, fuck, between 2006 and 2016, Vietnam had seen a 700% increase in arms imports. In that same time, the entire region's military defense budget had increased by 57%, sometimes doubling in countries like Vietnam and Cambodia. This is a pretty worrying trend, is it not? But this brings up certain moral issues for us in the West, as civilians, as journalists, even politicians. Because Southeast Asia is very mountainous, very jungly, a conventional ground combat situation might not be foreseeable. It might be more air and naval dominated, also because it's fighting over islands. So because it's not a kind of ground conventional combat, civilian lives and human rights allegations and all sort of bullshit really won't be involved or wouldn't be involved. So how do we paint that picture? Do we actually pay attention to it? Do we really care? Do we really panic like we normally do about a ground conventional war? I mean, for fuck's sake, we hardly care about Yemen and Saudi Arabia, for fuck's sake. The only reason why we do care is because the killing of Khashoggi highlighted how far Saudi Arabia is willing to go to further their own ends. We have been selling the Saudis hundreds of billions, collectively, of weapons for decades now. There's a giant cholera outbreak. Tens of thousands of civilians have been murdered by Saudi forces in Yemen. And it wasn't until, years after the war started, a journalist was murdered in a foreign country by Saudi officials, assumingly, that we actually started paying attention to it. I think it would be kind of disingenuous to paint Saudi Arabia versus Yemen and China versus whatever country in Southeast Asia as even remotely similar. With China, they're fighting over islands which have important trade routes. A lot of oil is involved. You have the interests of ASEAN involved as well, which could very quickly turn into a military alliance of sorts. Then you have Indian interests in the region and American interests in the region. So it might not turn into a full-scale World War III scenario, but it would very quickly turn into a proxy war between, competing powers in the region. Similar to how Saudi Arabia is a proxy war between Iran and them and Yemen, but it's on a much larger and vastly more dangerous scale. People also might pay attention ideologically. The evil communist People's Republic is trying to take land from its capitalist southern neighbors. But who do we side with? Who do we take the side of on the left? Do we side with China for historical land claims and trying to evict American power? Or do we stand with the United States because they want freedom and freedom of navigation? What about the nations being affected? What about the Philippines? What about Brunei? What about Vietnam? What about Malaysia? These are the countries and the fishermen of those countries that this illegal imperialist land grab is actually affecting. And it seems as if not many people on the left who actually talk about this issue are talking about that. What about the ideas of Westphalian sovereignty? Supporting China against the United States is meaningless. I'll just say it now. It's clouded in ideology, and it's a smokescreen for the real issue. But also, supporting America and their struggle against China in the South China Sea is just supporting American imperialism and supporting, to some degree, capitalist imperialism. But could you say that it's not the same thing when you support China? I mean, supporting either or is supporting imperialism and giving public legitimacy to Chinese or American imperialism in the region. But defending smaller nations could be criticized as chauvinism and, nationalism and giving nationalist sentiment their time to shine and defending worthless human-drawn borders. I mean, America did the same fucking thing in the Caribbean in the 1800s and the early 1900s. So sure, China isn't cooing nations and sending the CIA in secret missions and creating these ridiculous School of the America style things, training murderers and dictators on the right wing. But what they are doing is sending in private and state-owned companies to promise investment in infrastructure linking China and these countries physically but also economically with trade deals and free trade zones. And instead of training dictators like the School of the Americas or like America has done, they're just working with them. I mean, fuck, let's bring up the military government of Myanmar. China wanted to build a port and pipelines and a hydroelectric dam and I think a highway or two through Myanmar to bypass the Straits of Malacca. Instead of listening to what the people in the region had wanted with this hydroelectric dam, which was stopped after Aung San Suu Kyi took power, China just worked with the military government. And the money that China had pumped into Myanmar for these projects often also went to corrupt practices that enriched the military leaders. What about working with Iran, a country known to have some very draconian Islamic laws, but also a country that has moved into Iraq and Afghanistan post-American invasions and boosted the Shia communities and support for Iran in the Shia communities, trying to establish more control over the national and regional governments of those countries. And you can see in Iraq that this worked. Uganda, the country infamous for the Kill the Gays bill, in which China worked with to build a highway through. What about Sri Lanka? Sri Lanka had a port built for them in which they couldn't afford the payments for the loans they were given, so they defaulted on them, and then they signed an agreement with Chinese companies to, pass over the port on a 99-year lease. There's something vaguely Hong Kong about that situation. There's also rumor of something similar could happen in Tanzania, but the Tanzania government's like, no, we can pay it back, don't worry, but I hope that's true, but you never know. I mean, this kind of just, shits on the ideas of Westphalian sovereignty. Westphalian sovereignty, for those who don't know, it's basically the idea that a country should be allowed to have its own control within its own borders with no interference from an outside power. The Peace of Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War and granted Dutch independence and limits Spain's power, blah, 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 and kind of, it's the building blocks for our current, or at least pre-2000, ideas of what sovereignty is and national self-determination. The international order pre-invasion of Iraq has basically been built upon the ideas of Westphalian sovereignty in the Peace of Westphalia. I mean, we can argue all day that these ideals aren't exactly compatible with capitalism, hint, hint, video idea. So I will argue that who to side with on this issue of the South China Sea is very ideologically clouded. People don't want to support America because America is bad and evil. Obviously, they're right. But people want to side with China because they're against America, who is the bad guy. But they don't see that China is doing the same thing, just in a different time frame, under different circumstances. Yes, we stand against American imperialism in all forms, but we have to also stand against social imperialism in all forms. Just because a country is called the People's Republic and ruled by a communist party filled with billionaires and millionaires, might I add, doesn't mean we have to support either side, especially the communist one. Siding with China on the issue of the South China Sea is siding with imperialism. But what about the historical land claims that you've only touched on once and haven't really focused on at all? Because fuck them. I don't care. China is one of the largest countries in the world, okay? They don't need these islands. The islands are a smokescreen for their imperialist policies and practices with the nationalist vision of the Chinese dream and trying to throw around the never again thing with the century of humiliation. That's all it is. The nationalist dream of China depends upon these islands as well, because control of South China Sea does in some way guarantee the eviction of American power and the furthering of their own in the region. If you want to know more about that stuff and this in general, where I'm coming from, watch my videos on the Belt Road Initiative and the Hong Kong thing and the String of Pearls theory. I'll link all three of those below. They're kind of long, 2 to 20 minutes each, depending on which one you watch. But I suggest it because it gives a bit more context as to why I'm so annoyed and angry about this whole situation.